I thought I'd do a quick update on the state of the Esprit project. If you've seen the recent workshop update video, you'll have seen all the various transmissions. The one on the trolley here is the good one, which has its top cover off because I've got to swap over from this selector shaft, which has the operating lever on the left, to the way my linkage is set up, which is on post S2 cars, so the turbo and S3, with the right hand fore and aft lever. I'm doing some experiments with the crossgate selection, which we'll come to in a bit. On the floor is my lovely dummy transmission, which has only the input or clutch shaft and its primary shaft in the casing, so that I can actually pick this up with one hand, balance it at the front and get it on and off the engine fairly easily. So I've been using this to check the engagement of the longer input shaft. The one that's mounted in there is from a Citroen DS, which is about 10mm longer than the Lotus item. The one that's being used as an alignment tool is the one that came with this V6 engine conversion. Has got damage to the splines. I think you can see the line there, where it wasn't being retained in the input shaft. And this one has been modified with an extension on the front to reach the bearing in the back of the crankshaft. And I'm looking at changing this arrangement, as I think I've previously mentioned. But I'm getting an engagement of 95% plus in the splines in the clutch disc, which is actually more engagement length than we have here. So it should be okay, at least for the miles I'm probably going to drive this car. It'll be a long time before a problem occurs and I have to deal with it. But on the other hand, if I skim the adapter plate down by a few millimetre, I can get that 100% engagement. And I may want to look at the alignment of this plate, make sure the engine and gearbox are running concentrically. So I haven't made any significant progress on the intake system. The throttle bodies are sitting on the fuel tank over here, and I've been going backwards and forwards on how to mount these to the intake runners, and I'm going back towards the idea of using the Triumph manifold adapter rubbers, which I thought were just a sleeve, but looking again, they're actually a little alloy casting with a pair of mounting bolts and an O-ring in the face, and then a sleeve that clamps down, excuse the noise, over these stubs. And I think that's a reasonable approach to take. I'm worried about the flexibility, because these throttle bodies have to be synchronized together, but I think I can add a mounting system between the intake runner plate and the throttle bodies to make everything rigid, so that I keep everything in sync nicely. Now, the other stuff on the gearbox is we have the Citroen Maserati derived gear lever assembly, and it has a stop plate bolted on here, and this side is your reverse gear lockout, and this plate has been notched out, and this is because the cable operated mechanism that moves across the gate, so that's between your first, second, third, fourth, fifth and reverse slots, was in poor condition, and rather than replacing the cable, and it is a little bit of a hassle to do so, and the cables are I think about £110 plus that these days. Someone has just notched this plate out to get more travel to try and get the shift linkage to work properly. So when I've determined exactly how much crossgate travel I get, I can just build this up again, get it back to standard. But reading around, sitting a couple of people's cars, there is always a fair amount of backlash in the crossgate cable that I don't like the feel of, and as an experiment I'm modifying the selector here to run a twin pull cable setup rather than a push pull. So you can see there's the original lever or bell crank type mechanism, and I, using a transfer punch, marked the centre of the pivot and the existing hole, just using a scale, marked the centre point, join that down, and then using a set of old drafting compasses, did a little bit of geometry, so took a radius from here to here and transferred it across, and also a radius between these two centres and transferred that across to get a second position. And with a certain amount of bandsaw work and filing, we have a duplicate here that'll get TIG welded on, and we can then try out a twin cable pull setup which I can adjust all the backlash out of. And obviously cables tend to work better in pull than they do in push, so hopefully this will result in a better selector mechanism. But going back to the transmission again and the setup here, there's an additional problem with the clutch, which was that the stack up height, so the distance from the back of the block, or the back of the adapter plate in this case, to the operating things of the diaphragm, this appears to be shorter on this setup than it was on the Lotus. I mean, you know, the input shaft is further out, so by at least 10 millimeters, and I think this was the cause of the very heavy yet very light clutch. So I could actually push the pedal down and feel the diaphragm operating by hand. It was that light. It had gone from like a 7/8 inch slave cylinder to a 1 1/8 inch slave cylinder, massive thing, apparently off a Chevy truck. And the clutch still didn't really, the clutch pedal got heavy at its full travel, and the clutch still didn't like disengaging properly. And I had a hell of a job when I drove this car round from the front to the workshop. I had a hell of a job getting enough clutch to keep it moving, and when I investigated, the adjustable push rod had so much preload on it, the clutch was almost partially disengaged all the time, and yet still wouldn't release properly. As I wound the preload off, I actually got a better clutch action, which is completely illogical. But I think the issue was that, we'll have to look at it on this gearbox, because the mechanism is still in place. This rod here has a domed surface on the end, and that's the pivot point for the clutch release lever. And I have several of these now, but here's one. So here's your adjustable push rod, because there isn't enough travel in the clutch slave cylinder on this design of bell housing and slave cylinder to accommodate all the possible movement with clutch plate wear. So at a certain interval you would have to check the free play on the cylinder and adjust this. They went to a side mounted cylinder with more travel, and that became an obsolete adjustment. This is the rather dirty one, but you've got a pivot point in here that runs on. Oh, well, here's a spare adjuster, and you can see I'd found a couple of these extra heavy duty spacer washers to think about spacing it out, but because I have spares and it's the sort of thing I can quite easily do, this is a little experiment, which is where there was a hole for a split pin that went through the hole in the pivot point just to keep the lever in place. I've set this one up so that I can use a little 6mm rod end bearing, and I will then machine up a housing that will mount here as original, but will actually allow me to adjust the pivot point to get the actuating angle of the lever right, because I think what was happening was the lever was actually fouling in the slot in the bell housing and trying to pivot around the bell housing rather than the pivot point, and that's when it got heavy and you didn't get enough travel. Well, I had a little break for a couple of days and went off to collect a new addition to the workshop, which will undoubtedly be the subject of a future video. But catching up on some of the work I was doing, you can see here the finished modified bell crank arrangement for the gear shift and assembled back together. And you can see the lever underneath is the in-gate rod, and this right hand side is the original, would have operated the push-pull cable, and it's now got a duplicated ear to operate a pair of individual pull cables. So when the gearbox goes back in the car, we can start sorting out the other end of that linkage. And these are the Triumph intake rubbers, manifold adapters, whatever you want to call them. So these are the ones that I described that have the alloy casting with an O-ring as a face seal, and then the rubber ring to clamp. I bought two sets. The first set turned up, I looked at them and said, yeah, that'll work for me, I'll order another set. And this is the set where I didn't look closely enough at the pictures, because if I zoom in here you can see it's debonding. These have got some corrosion on them that's got in behind the rubber and debonded it. Fortunately these were sort of £12–13 for a set, and I've got another set on order that will be turning up in a few days, so we'll be able to get on with that section of things. I've been saying I wanted to check the alignment of the adapter plates, you know, gearbox to engine, and this is the setup that I've rigged up to be able to do that. So I've only got the one bolt in at the top there, and the alignment is pretty good for that hole at least. And see what I can do with these other holes. That one's pretty good. that one is way off. Bear with me. Yeah, that one's not terrific. That one's not great. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. And that's before I took the plate off the engine and looked at a few other things. So let's do that. So if I remove that bolt, and the bell housing will simply, well, if I get the alignment right, will slide off. My alignment checking tool. Very fortuitously, the bore in the crankcase, in the gearbox case, is 35mm, and the diameter on the back of the crankshaft that locates the flywheel is 35mm. And I happen to have some scrap Marzocchi fork legs from one of my Marinis, which are 35mm, or at least very slightly under. So I machined up a bit of old welded up hub that I had lying around in the junk pile, and that is being held into the back of the crank with a bit of all thread running into a roll bolt, an expanding concrete anchor or brick anchor. People should be fairly familiar with those. And at the moment the plate is just held onto the back of the case with the one bolt, and it's hanging on the two factory alignment dowels. So if I take this bolt out, bear with, I have chased all these threads out, but I might have picked up a bit of dirt again. Oh, there we go. Okay, so the first thing to note is that there's a little bit of wiggle on the dowels. So our alignment might have been slightly flattered by that. But as you can see, I've already had this off and made some notes on it. Some of the countersunk holes were simply not needed. The bell housing cleared them anyway. But let's zoom in on those countersinks. And well, I was going to joke I could do better with a spoon, but no, I couldn't do. But I probably couldn't do much worse. That one in particular is absolutely horrendous. The holes in the plate aren't round. I think they must have been done with a handheld drill, and they've all, I don't know if it'll show up on camera. Let's use a bolt head. It's catching on a burr. Every single one of these has not had the edge of the hole chamfered to remove the burr. The mounting holes for the starter motor look pretty horrible. So I'm going to be making a new adapter plate, and I have a piece of 15mm plate rather than the 20, which will give me those few extra millimeters of clutch shaft engagement into the clutch plate. And see, I've drawn a straight line on here. This is just the piece of the plate that covers over the recess for the Lotus starter motor, which of course we're not using. And by reducing the dimension of the plate by this amount, given that this will be ordered as a rectangular piece, that saved about £10 cost, pounds sterling, in ordering the plate. And I'll just do that piece separately as a dust cover. It had no dust cover over the back of the flywheel, so I shall be adding that to it as well. It has the flywheel pickup there. It's got the trigger wheel on the back of the flywheel. So that's where we are at the moment. I'm waiting for that piece of plate to arrive, and also some pieces of 6mm by 75mm wide mild steel, bright mild steel flat stock to make the plates for these adapters to bolt onto and to weld to the intake runners. So we've made a little progress, and we've had a little bit of a step back as well. But overall, reasonably pleased. I at least know where I'm going, what I'm doing, what the outcome should be, and hopefully that will all come this next week, and I might even have some of it done and can do another update.